Today I'm speaking with Michael Beverly. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, I so appreciate you doing this, and I love getting to meet people and hearing their new stories. And your story is quite different from what I can see from my notes here, so I'm looking forward to hearing some of the details. But just to give a quick bio as we get started, Michael was born in Hawaii, but he grew up both in Hawaii and California, but now lives in Guadalajara, Mexico, which is really, really cool. He has four kids, three of whom are adults, and one is a 5-month old. So that's a story we need to hear. He also has a grandson. His dad was a marine biologist and his mom was a pastor. So he's sort of a pastor's kid there. And he's also the son of divorced parents. So we'll talk about that and how it influenced his walk with Christ. He grew up in the Vineyard movement, but he did fully deconvert back in 2012. So you've been out for a little bit. I'm sure there's some interesting changes that happen as you have further and further distance from that moment of deconversion. He's also a YouTuber. I do want to encourage everyone, please go check out the link beneath this video. It's just under his name, Michael Beverly. But please go like and subscribe. Check out his great work there. That's what I know about you so far, Michael. If you could, please tell us more about yourself and some fun things or hobbies.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I mean, one of my biggest hobbies, of course, is YouTube. I got in the space about a year and a half ago, seriously, and I really enjoyed meeting people. A lot of my adult social life is now on YouTube and making friends and with live streams, and then sort of making friends off of the internet because I live in a foreign country and I have a 5-month-old. So a lot of my social life ended with having a baby. So yeah, I do get a lot of, I do, my hobby and my social life is kind of interconnected with that. But I also, although this hasn't been true in the last few months because of the baby, I also like to read a lot. I enjoy, Netflix stuff about, true crime is one of my favorites, and also, fantasy and sci-fi and those kind of things. Um, as far as hobbies go, that's kind of it. Like I haven't picked up anything outside of that. I mean, sometimes I wish I had another hobby, but I am looking forward to, when my little one's a little bit older, of getting back into chess. I did play chess for quite a bit in board games during COVID. So we had a lot of game nights during COVID, and I do kind of miss that.
Hmm. I'm curious, how do your adult kids feel about having a new sibling so far down the line?
Yeah, no, it's actually pretty cool. So, my when I told my kids I was having another baby, so about a year and a half ago, roughly. Of course, they were shocked, but they all had a univocal voice. Dad, you're a good dad, and this is great, and we support you. Now, the youngest of my adult kids lived with me, as well as her sister. Two of my adult kids. This is a testament to being a good dad, I guess. During COVID, two of my daughters moved to another country to live with their dad. So I'm super proud of that. So I lived with them for quite a bit, and they both ended up getting married down here, and met their husbands here in Mexico. One married a Mexican national who is from Guadalajara, and they're back in the States now. And the other one married an expat, so not a Mexican American guy, but he has roots in other countries, and they got married. He was a friend of mine. She met a friend of mine, and they got married, and they just had a baby. So I have a new grandson here that will also be a Mexican, because he's born here in Mexico with just a month and a half after my son was born. And we were just I was just with them 2 nights ago, and we lined the kids up together. So my son was born 6 weeks premature, which was a whole nother story of the craziness and insanity. And yeah, I mean, I could tell you all kinds of crazy stories about being in Mexico. One of them is I got married on Saturday, the day before the C-section, because my older of my 2 daughters is an attorney, and she calls me up on Friday and says, "Dad, I was just looking over the immigration policies and the laws on citizenship, and it's going to be a big problem for you, especially with the new administration, and God knows what's going to happen. You need to get married like today." And I'm like, we're having a baby in 2 days. And she says, "I don't care." So we got on the phone, and my girlfriend, now wife, found a cousin who found somebody, and we actually had a government official show up on Saturday, and we got married in the hospital room on Saturday, and had a C-section on. And the reason for that is because if a child is born out of wedlock, it adds a whole nother layer of paperwork to proving that the child born out of the States is a U.S. citizen. So anyway, so now I'm married and have a new baby, and for anybody that likes little cute babies, he appears in my videos quite a bit because I do a lot of editing with him, like sitting on my lap or with him involved. So he occasionally makes an appearance when he's in the mood.
That's
Just
awesome.
little snippets here and there.
Yeah, you had quite an adventure.
Yeah, it's been quite an adventure. I moved down here I moved here partly motivated by politics, not completely. Like it'd be a fun story to say in 2016 when Trump was first elected that I decided politically to leave America. That would be a great story. It's not completely true, but it played an influence in why I left the States, was the political environment, and also my father and my brother had expated, both had lived out of America for many years, and they'd been telling me for years, you don't know what you're missing by just, if you don't ever try another culture and moving, you won't know. And they were right. When I wasn't here very long when I realized it was like a good decision. Like I really felt that being here has opened up a new world of opportunities and new experiences, and understanding the world isn't America centric. And I tend to think of it sort of a kind of like a deconstruction, like even leaving the church, because when you're in that environment, you're seeped in it. You're like a fish in water. You just kind of think everything through that lens. And I think living in, and I imagine this would be true with wherever you grew up, but for Americans, you're very much taught, patriotism and America first and America this and America that. And then you go somewhere else and you realize, wait a minute, people don't see America quite the way they see it. So yeah. And of course, and I love tacos. Who doesn't love tacos? So that part's worked out really well.
Yeah, well, even whether you live somewhere different or not, just visiting somewhere different is so helpful. I mean, I know I went to the Dominican Republic and I went to Papua New Guinea and some other places, and just even those little trips, you end up seeing the world differently, and think that your experience was so limited, both in terms of your worldview, but also even just basic things like how you live and what foods you eat and how you how you go from here to there. It's just crazy, and it opens your eyes to, I think, to a lot of poverty when you go to certain places where you're just like, wow, there's the first world problems that I have are truly first world problems, and like I need to be a lot more grateful for what I've got and a lot more aware of the needs so I can give when I can.
Yeah, it's a huge culture shock. So where I live now, I live in like a middle class neighborhood of pretty family oriented. There's markets and of course some churches and some schools, and I'm the only foreigner. Like I don't see not just another white person, but I don't see anybody. No black people, no Asian people, no Europeans, nobody. I am the gringo in this neighborhood, and everybody's super nice to me, and they help me because my Spanish is terrible. I can shop for food. I know most of the words when I'm shopping, and I've been taking the baby out to the market, and everybody's super excited to see the baby now that we wouldn't take him out in the beginning because he was premature and it compromised with immunity, and I was worried, but now he's fine and he loves going out and seeing the neighborhood, and I take him with me to shop for, going out and get some eggs and bread and that kind of stuff. And the people at the markets love to say hi to him, and he's super cute. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's a way different world, a way different experience. And I was encouraged to do this by my dad and my brother, and for many years I didn't listen to them. So my dad actually expated to New Caledonia in the South Pacific, and he recently passed away. In fact, my son is named Stephen after my dad, who's Stephen Beverly, and my dad Stephen passed away within just a couple months of my son being born. So it was kind of he's the namesake of my dad. And New Caledonia is a French colony, so my dad actually married and became French. He had dual citizenship. And you mentioned Papua New Guinea. My dad has worked in all of the Pacific, so he spent some time in Port Moresby doing work, and his wife, or now widow, is that's her family heritage. Her father was from Papua New Guinea. So yeah, it's a small world these days. And as a weird aside, my brother moved to Bali, then he moved to Jakarta and got married. Then he moved back to Hawaii because he needed to earn some money, and then he moved back to to Bali, which is where he lives now. And he had been telling me for years, yeah, you need to try living somewhere else. And that's a whole nother interesting story in its own. My brother actually had to convert to Islam. So my brother's a Muslim because in Indonesia, you can't marry a Muslim woman and if you're not a Muslim. So I asked him when he got married, because I was still a Christian when he did this. I said, aren't you worried about that? Like, it's like demonic. It's like, it's going to be bad for you. Like you're a lot. And he said, to me, it's like pledging allegiance to Spider-Man. And I get that now. It's funny to me now, but at the time I was worried about my brother. Like I was, how could you do that? How could you become a Muslim? But his wife's a cultural Muslim. So, she believes, but she married an American white guy and she drinks wine and eats pork. So it's kind of interesting how that growing up in that. So because of the influences of my dad and my brother, that kind of drove me to eventually move. But what is really interesting is both my dad and my brother are atheists, and they never were able to influence me to take atheism or even just leaving Christianity seriously. And when I finally deconstructed, they're like, yeah, welcome to the club. Like I didn't get it. It's very weird to me how there's so many things I didn't get until I had an understanding.
So I feel like I've got a lot of questions for sure about that part of your journey, but I do want to make sure we set the stage first. Could you take us back to the early days? Like, what was it like in your family growing up, and what were the messages that you heard about the Bible and about Jesus?
So my dad was an atheist from a little child, but my parents divorced when I was maybe 5 years old. So I don't remember a lot. My dad had very little influence on me as a child. So in my early days, I guess you would call me an implicit atheist, in that I didn't have a God belief, but I wasn't explicit. I didn't have an anti-God belief. I just didn't believe. I didn't know anything. My mom had suffered a very, very serious abuse as a child, and she would eventually be diagnosed with MPD, which is multiple personality disorder, which is now the diagnosis for that is now called DID, dissociative identity disorder. So they've changed the way it's described. So it's not like the movies at all. It's not like that. The movies the movies and people's idea of multiple personality disorder is not reality. The reality is there's a dissociative disorder thing that happens where the mind kind of fractures to help somebody cope. And that's what happened to my mom. So I sort of grew up with somebody that was a little bit nuts. And I mean that in a nice way. Like I'm using this as in a vernacular way. My mom was very loving and kind and empathetic, and she was a beautiful, beautiful woman. But she also had all this trauma that she didn't know how to process. And that drove her to Christianity. So at 10 years old, we were living in Maui. Her boyfriend was a dope grower. At the time, in today's vernacular, it'd be weed. But back in the day, in the 70s, it was dope. So we lived on East Maui, which is way, way out in the boondocks of Maui, there's a little town called Hana. For anybody that's vacationed in Hawaii, they probably know what it is. So we lived out there, and he grew weed in the forest, and my mom did some housekeeping work for a rich guy who owned a cattle ranch. And one of the Hawaiian guys who worked on the cattle ranch was a pastor, and my mom was seeking. And my mom talked to him one day, like, do you go to church? Do you believe in God? And he said, well, yeah, by the way, it's in my backyard. The church is in my backyard, and I'm the pastor. So we started going to this little Christian church, a non-denominational family thing. And it was a weekend thing. We would literally go there on Saturday and spend the night and then wake up Sunday. So it was like a camp out for me as a kid. And this is in a beautiful Hawaiian jungle with streams, and we'd go swimming, and I'd play with all the kids. And so for me, it was a wonderful experience, and it introduced me to Christianity. Keep in mind, I'm about 5th grade. So I'm going through this, transition into puberty in the next few years. And I just fell in love with Jesus. I bought my own Bible. I started teaching Sunday school. I was advanced reader. So I was both in love with Jesus and able to read. So that would become, I'd be like teaching scriptures as, to other little kids. And we would go we would go into the adult church and talk about the things that we learned, and so I would eventually develop a desire to be either a pastor or a something in the in the church. And we
Mm.
left in I want to say at 1979ish. So by the early 80s I was in Southern California. Through a series of reasons, my mom gets married to her boyfriend because the church tells her she can't be living with some guy, right? So she gets married to another abuser. So she had a long history of attaching herself to abusive men. Um, and so when we moved to Southern California, we lived in Orange County. So Orange County is very Republican, conservative, and very, you don't talk about stuff. So, at the time we were specifically instructed never talk about marijuana, like just never talk about it. Okay. So it just went in the back of my mind, and we get plugged into various churches. My mom was still seeking at the time for the right church. I remember once we went to Melody Land, which was a big deal back in the day. And one time we were in church and they were doing communion, and my mom said, "Don't take communion. You're not old enough. You don't understand." I'm like, "Okay, I don't want to, you'll bring a curse down on yourself." So I'm like, "Okay, I won't do communion." And then eventually, as I went into high school, my mom was pretty good about this. She allowed me to go off to my own church. So I ended up going to a Presbyterian church because that's where my high school friends went. And, I was involved in youth ministry. And when I got out of high school, my girlfriend gets pregnant. We get married right away. I was 19 at marriage and 20 as a father. We were married by the youth pastor at the Presbyterian church where we went. And we were very, like, we were a Christian couple, thinking we were doing the right thing to honor Jesus. Sorry, we had sex before marriage, but now we're married. And then we had another baby, and then that was it. My wife at the time said, "That's it, no more kids." She got her tubes tied, and we're like, "Okay, the family's done." And we were very, we were very religious and very in love with Jesus. Now, just as an ironically, my son and I just had a conversation the other day because he just graduated from getting a master's in law. So both of my two adult kids from my first marriage are lawyers. What that tells you about our family life, you can just imagine. And so he's in the military, and he's a major. He just got promoted to major, and he also just graduated from the master's of law school. Anyways, his mom was visiting him, and he got in a huge fight with his mom because his mom's still a fundamentalist. Dinosaurs aren't real, Trump supporter, Trump's great for America, and dinosaurs aren't real, and Jesus is coming. So he got in a huge fight with his mom about that stuff. And it's funny, him and I talk about it. We sort of kind of laughed about it, but he grew up, he was raised in that environment. And when you're raised in that environment, it's, as we know, it's very hard to get out of that. His younger sister, but the older of the two daughters I have, she deconstructed in her teens. And I would just pray for her. She's going to come back to Jesus. And, and I would bring up like, "Hey, do you think you want to go to church?" And she's like, "Dad, I don't want to discuss this with you. That's it." And she had very good boundaries. So her and I remained very friendly, but we never talked about church and Jesus. She just went on, on her own. Then I got remarried and had another child. So my third one was 13 years younger than her sister. And she, of course, was also raised in the church. But around 11 or 12, around the same time I was going through my deconstruction, she started praying to God. "God, I don't know if you're really there. I'm sorry for questioning." And she went through her own process. Now, of course, people would later accuse me of manipulating her, but that was never me. I've never told my kids what to think or believe, other than I took them to church and told them it was real. But I never, like, when she was deconstructing, I never said, "Yeah, team atheist is right and good thing you're leaving." I just we just talked about how she was feeling and what she thought. And she sort of worked that process out on her own. So my family life in my 20s, I was a young earth creationist. When you talk about loving Jesus, I went back when my kids were young. I moved back to Maui, and I got involved eventually with Assemblies of God. So before I would end up in the Vineyard movement, which is quite charismatic. And much, much different from the Presbyterian church that I was involved in in my early 20s. My wife at the time really liked the Assemblies of God because she connected more with the Pentecostal stuff. I was uncomfortable with it. I didn't really care for it, but I saw that people were happy and they loved Jesus. So I kind of tolerated the weird stuff and just stuck with, like Bible, the Bible teaching stuff. I was more kind of dry, I guess, but I love Jesus and I love to pray. And there was a teacher that came there that taught on young earth creationism. So I've got way involved in that. And I had believed evolution was, quote, a lie, even through high school. I wrote my biology report on how evolution's a lie and it's the lie of Satan, and scientists.
Was that mostly because of what your mom said to you?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So keep in mind, this report I wrote in 1981. There's no internet. There's libraries, of course, but there's not like what there is today in terms of information on, say, deconstruction or counter apologetics, right? And so there wasn't a, Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and Sam Harris back then, and there was no internet. And so when you're told by your whole community, this is true, and this is what good people reject evolution, because that's believing in evolution is the foundation of all this terrible stuff, homosexuality and witchcraft and, abortion and, all the evil liberal stuff is all influenced by evolution. Because if you believe we, quote, came from nothing and we evolved, then that will let you have these terrible beliefs. So I was fully on board for that. So my readings, the stuff like that my mom helped me borrow from the library, would be the early creationist literature. And that, I was just looking back in the, ironically, I was just in a recording. I was doing some stuff with P.Z. Meyer and Dr. Dan of Creation Myths and my good friend, Dr. Jay Bundy, who's an evolutionary biologist. And we were talking about this very issue. I actually pulled out that report. I have it in my files. I'm not very nostalgic. I don't keep a lot of stuff. I don't have much stuff from high school, but I have kept that as a reminder to how easy it is to be indoctrinated and really, really believe. Like, I really believe this stuff. So looking back on it is, wow, it's just crazy. And so I didn't have the support or the process to kind of go outside of that at the time. So looking back at this period in high school and my early adult years, the flow of that is just so natural. It's just natural because of where my foundation, where I started at, say, 10 years old. And I know you probably have questions about that, of being a child and it's a little bit strange, because I think if my parents hadn't divorced when I was maybe 5 years old or so, I don't know how my life would have turned out, because the influence of my dad as being a scientist, my dad taught marine biology and at the high school level. So do you have some thoughts, like some questions you want to ground me back in that? Early days?
I was curious about a few things. Did you keep in touch with your dad over the years?
Yes. So when my parents divorced at 5, my mom took us to Maui, and at the time, just a phone call, unlike people today don't realize how crazy it was back then. It was prohibitively expensive just to make a phone call from Maui to Oahu. Yeah. So I would maybe talk to my dad every few months and see him on average maybe once in a year. Now, I did stay in contact with my father. The last time I saw my father was just about a year before he passed. So last March 2024, he was going through cancer treatment and he came to the States. So my dad had expated to New Caledonia. I visited him there twice. And during my high school and young adult years, he would come to America maybe once every couple of years. So we did stay in touch. He would send me some clips once in a while, like non-stamp collector early video clips, but they went completely over my head. And we never really argued about this stuff. And because I didn't live with my dad and because I didn't see him like every other weekend, there was nothing like that. His influence was very minimal in terms of me having the ability to have multiple viewpoints. So I just went, I just lived with my mom and followed in her footsteps.
Do you think that was a point of heartbreak for him as he sort of watched you from a distance growing up and not being able to impart his worldview to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. He would later communicate that he felt that my mom had brainwashed us, which she had, and that he had no control over it, which he did not. So yes, that now looking back, the the last phone call I had with my father was I was in the hospital. My young son Stephen, who is the namesake of my dad, Stephen, we talked on the phone, and he called me to tell me how sorry he was, and he knew he didn't have much longer. And I said, Dad, there's nothing to be sorry about. I've forgiven you for everything. There's no hard feelings. I love you. That's the end. We're good, Pop. And he said, thank you. And we had a nice conversation, and that was the last time we spoke. The the sad part, I mean, this is one of the tragedies of divorce, as anybody that's gone through this is, ultimately the children lose, regardless of what's going on with the parents, the children lose. And I did feel, especially because my mom not only remarried, but she remarried somebody that was very abusive, that, that diminished my growing up. And I think that drove me into needing Christianity more, because Christianity was always a safe haven for me as a kid and as a young adult, because it meant every week I would go be with friends, and maybe every Wednesday night I would be with youth group. And that got me out of the house and got me, somewhere where you could feel hope and friendship
Yeah.
and love and, et cetera.
What did you say it was around age 10 that you first made a professional faith, or what was that age and what was that experience like?
Yeah. So when my mom started taking us to church, I just believed it 100%. There was never any doubt. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I love Jesus. I got baptized in a stream in Maui, a beautiful story. The guy that baptized me, believe it or not, was visiting the church from the other side of the island. I still remember his name to this day. His name was Paul Fingers, and he was a white guy from the States who was a Christian pastor. I don't remember his whole story. He was sort of a hermit. He, for whatever reason, was friends with friends, and he was there. And he's the one that baptized me, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I felt that was a significant event in my life. And so because I was leading younger kids every Sunday in Bible study, I was the Sunday school teacher, it just becomes self-reinforcing. You're teaching others about it, and then it becomes more true for you, and then you teach again, and you have these feelings, these emotions of peace and love, and you just know it's true. I mean, of course, you're 10 years old. I would have felt it was true if my mom had took us into the Hare Krishnas, which we actually, my mom, when she was seeking, we actually went to a weekend with the Hare Krishnas, who were super nice. And
Oh, wow.
I could have ended up a Hindu. My mom was a genuine seeker. She was talking to the Jehovah's Witnesses. She was trying to find what was true. And she landed on evangelical Christianity in a non-denominational church, which is a very easy place to land, because, as anyone knows, when you get in a sect that has that's like, if you get involved with the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, you automatically know you're doing something that's kind of off the shelf. It's a little bit different. So the easy route is like a kind of a mainline or non-denominational, or I suppose if we had started going to the Catholic Church, that would have been easy too. Like it's just more acceptable in society. And yeah, it was just a very easy slide for me to believe in Jesus, to believe in God, and to believe that it's all true. And today I truly believe that indoctrinating children is a form of child abuse, and I will stand on that, and I talk about that on my channel. And it isn't
100%.
it isn't that, I understand when Christians have kids, they're going to teach them about Christianity. I get it. And what I try to tell people is I don't want to do that to my kid in terms of, it's not like I'm going to teach him atheism is true and you better believe it. No, like I want him to learn to think. So I look back on that as my mom subjected me to a form of manipulation and abuse, not intentionally. Like my mom was a good, loving person, and she was also a victim. And so she did the best she could. And,
Exactly.
I forgave my mom many years. My mom actually passed away from a genetic disease that she died quite young in her early 60s. And I had deconstructed. So we had to, through that period, we worked out stuff. And, of course I forgave my mom and I love my mom. But looking back, I see how much abuse I was subjected to being a kid in the church. And by, I don't mean the horrific time. Like, we tend to hear abuse and we think, oh, that means something sexual or something physical or something. No. Abuse can just be being overly nice and teaching bad things. That can be abusive too, because
Yeah.
you withhold the ability for a child to think. And that, to me, and you destroy curiosity, and you destroy the ability for a child to learn to individuate in society and learn their own way. And that's what was robbed from me. I didn't get to do that until my 50s or late 40s, maybe. But yeah, that's a terrible thing of my past.
And your mom pursued the role of pastor for a while, is that right?
Yeah. So my mom, when we moved back to California, my mom became a super Christian. So she started adopting. She adopted 2 kids, and then she realized she couldn't just keep adopting more kids. So she became an emergency foster parent, which meant over the next decade or so, there would be 100+ kids would go through our house. So the county would send kids who were recently taken from their parents for everything from or being arrested for drugs and other terrible things. And then before they could be placed anywhere, they needed somewhere to go. So my mom was what was called an emergency shelter home. And in the process, she ended up adopting another. So there's 6 of us ultimately. And then as she realized, so the last one was had high medical needs, so she couldn't take more kids. And she did still continue to do later. She would do some emergency shelter stuff, but she mostly concentrated on the 6th child who had extreme medical needs. And as that child got older, she eventually would divorce the abuser that she was married to, in spite of her fear and guilt, because the church put on this, all this guilt and shame of getting divorced. And I even piled that on. Like, I remember telling my mom, you just have to, here's a book to read, Mom, you just have to be a better Christian and everything will be fine. This was a horrible thing I did to my own mother. Eventually I realized that no loving God would demand a woman subject herself to this abuse. And I helped my mom go through the process of getting divorced. So after that, she went into single parent ministry, because that was her experience and love. So she started as a lay leader in the church with the single mom ministry. And that led to a job as first like a receptionist assistant to a pastor. And then that led to becoming in charge of, I don't want to say therapy, but she wasn't a licensed therapist, but she did like counseling, and she helped with people going through stuff that she had experience in. And then eventually she was ordained and went on staff at the Anaheim Vineyard as a pastor. There was actually a protest once. There was people picketing in front. And I'm like, what's people picketing? They're like, oh, they're picketing because of your mom. I'm like, what did my mom do? They don't agree that women should be pastors. I'm like, well, she's not. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't a preaching pastor. Part of the reason she was a pastor was just because of the way there's a thing called the man's allowance, which allows tax breaks for pastors. That's part of why she was a pastor, was just for financial reasons, and also for the authority of it and so forth. But she was never like preaching or, but anyways, but I loved and respected my mom. So even like up until that point, I never thought of my mom as participating in the abuse I received by being indoctrinated. And my mom would pass away before she was ever able to think about that, which is terribly sad. But that's just kind of how those things go.
So she didn't see your deconstruction period?
No, she did. And she was, at this time, she was dying. So we never talked about it really. I mean, she knew I had become an atheist, and she loved me, and she prayed for me, and we never argued about it. And we never discussed the details, because at that point she was near the very end of her life, and she knew she had a terminal disease. So there was like There was, other than people would pray for her constantly, but of course that never worked and she died. We loved each other up until the end, even though we didn't agree on that kind of stuff.
Well, look, when you look at your story, I do want to get to the actual time of your deconstruction, but before you get into that, just maybe as a segue, when you look back at your childhood and teenage years, I know we've touched on the divorce pretty heavily and seeing abuse up close like that, but what other things do you look back on now and think to yourself, at the time that was not deconstructing me or deconverting me, but it actually was. It was like a early seed that eventually became part of the growth of this plant of critical thinking. What were some of those other early seeds that made a big difference to you?
Well, I was a very strong young Earth creationist, and I was living on Maui when somebody gave me a Hugh Ross book, and they said, "Hey, here's this Christian cosmologist who says the Earth is old, or the universe, the universe is old." So I read his book, and then I looked at Hawaii, and it's like, wait a minute, Hawaii has rivers you can ride boats on it. It's very eroded, and the Big Island is still volcanoes growing. And Maui, where I lived, has two volcano ranges. One last erupted in the 19th century, and one was 1,000,000 years old. And I couldn't reconcile that, because to me, it meant if God made it that way, he wanted us to believe the earth was old. That would be a trickster God. So I deconstructed from that. Now, that didn't help me go any farther, but it definitely was like what you're talking about, a seed in my mind, which I would later be able to reflect on. Hey, wait a minute, you believe this stuff, because I was a staunch young Earth creationist, like really hardcore. And I thought people that believed in evolution were part of the problem of why the world sucked. So being able to see that. I think the other things, I never really reflected on this, but I think also running in my subconscious was God doesn't really seem to show up when he should. Keep in mind, I ended up at the Vineyard that preached doing the stuff Jesus did, healing, healing, healing. But the founder of that, who was my pastor for a while, was John Wimber, who died very young of cancer. And then my mom got this terminal disease, and there's no cure for it. And of course, she died. There's no cure, and prayer doesn't work. Sorry, it doesn't work. And I think those things helped me. And I don't want to jump too far into my story, but when I eventually started deconstructing, I started putting those things together. Oh, wait a minute, there's a problem here. So most of my childhood, I would say I was just a Christian that loved Jesus, and I put aside any cognitive dissonance. Like I never thought, oh, my dad's going to hell, won't that be terrible? I just figured God will work it out. Like God will work that out. I never really thought about how terrible that doctrine is. So anything like that, I just kind of put it out of my mind. I read Evidence That Demands a Verdict in my late teens or early 20s. So Josh McDowell's book. And I read through that and I said, this is proof. Jesus has to be the Messiah, because the odds of all this happening and being true without Jesus being the Messiah would be, 1 in a billion, 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 trillion. Boy, those Jews sure are stupid, right? Like that was my thought. Like, well, how could the Jews be so dumb? How could Catholics think that Jesus didn't have siblings? It's so like the book says. So those things reinforce my belief that not only was Christianity true, but these other groups were just sort of blind or dumb or didn't understand. Now looking back on that, I think it's funny that I thought that, but I never got into apologetics. So a lot of people today that are used to YouTube and apologetics don't realize we didn't have the internet. We didn't have, there. Yeah, of course there was Billy Graham crusades. Like I went to Promise Keepers, believe it or not. There was these things, but there wasn't daily things you could. Nowadays you can go watch 1,000,000 interviews or talks or, people deconstructing or people having debates. None of that existed. So in my mind, I didn't need apologetics anymore, because Josh McDowell had proved it to me as a young man, or maybe a teen. I can't remember if I was late teens or early 20s when I read that. But for me, that settled the question. So I spent the rest of my Christian reading and studying about more on theology or how to live. And so there was never a question about whether it was true. The question was always, how should I then live? To loosely quote Bonhoeffer, how should we then live in this world of Christianity being true? How should I be a good neighbor? How should I be victorious in Christ? Those were the questions I asked. I never questioned the other stuff. There was no reason to.
Hmm. It's interesting you mentioned Bonhoeffer, and I think Francis Schaeffer took that same theme in one of his books too. It's some of those guys, I think they really get you where they make you really feel like you are taking a path of both sort of a stealthy erudition where you're becoming very clever.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this C.S. Lewis route. You're trying your best to dismantle all the godless, demonic perspectives. And when you're done doing it, taking all these little circuitous routes, and you end up basically poisoning the well so badly that you're really inoculated against the evolutionists and against secular people. You're pretty much at that point thinking they're all wrong, but also there's an arrogance that develops of like, there's no way for you all to understand the things of the Spirit of God because they have to be spiritually discerned, and you're worldly, you're carnal. But also, I think what it does for a lot of us, and this was true for me, is you end up you end up stopping needing the questions to be answered. Like you don't come at it from a question or a perspective of saying, if my apologetics questions don't get answers, like good answers, solid answers soon, I'm going to have a faith crisis. Like that's not where it goes. It goes to a point of saying, I don't even necessarily need the answers. I just understand that the best perspective that I have right now is to bow my knee in submission to the God of the universe, who will certainly illuminate me when he wants to, even if it's after death. But I'm not going to be like doubting Thomas and say, I'm only going to believe if you give me all this evidence. Like Jesus is directly inviting you and asking you, please accept the blessing of believing when you don't understand how it all works. Just trust me. I'll take care of it, but it is me doing it all. And there is a plan. You get to a point where you don't care about what anybody says about anything. You've just blocked them out. I mean, it's this poisoning the well on steroids. And I
100%,
especially when you're adding in not just the philosophers like C.S. Lewis, but the theologians, where you're going into like my journey was very heavy into the Reformed theology. You know, I was looking at, R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, Charles Spurgeon. I mean, those guys and many others like them that was my bread and butter. And so when you're mixing the philosophy, the Christian philosophy and the theologians, you get yourself pretty darn stuck. I mean, you can get to a point where you are really blind to almost like you have intentionally just blocked out everything. There is nothing but this blinded perspective of it is all God. Everything is God. And I remember the way that took over for me was I literally was working on books that basically took this concept and just sort of institutionalized it for myself. One of them was a book on worldview that was basically about undoing evolution and saying, if evolution is garbage and God isn't random, what he does isn't random, then everything he does, the way he designed a dove, the way the tree rings grow, everything is as in some way going to reflect his personality, the gospel, or the kingdom to come. And then the other book I was working on was a book on prayer, where everything I was learning, like, you read C.S. Lewis and think, oh, that's a great quote or whatever. I would take that, and instead, where C.S. Lewis might say, he, God, is doing this, or he, God, is like that, I would turn it into a prayer and say, you, God, are doing this, you, God, are like that. And I would put it into categories that made sense. Mm-hmm. It was a 1,000-page prayer book. And like that's where my last big hurrah was before Christianity sort of began to shift for me. But when you're in it, you are so arrogant and so blind. It's almost scary looking back at it,
100%. The arrogance and narcissism is off the charts of, I know the truth. Now it's funny because that you brought up MacArthur and Sproul. I remember reading John MacArthur had a book on the charismatics. So I picked that up as a young adult.
Strange Fire.
And I thought to myself, this poor old man just doesn't understand. Like he recognizes that we're good, but he thinks we're off the ranch, but he's just wrong. Right. He's, here I was, not even a college education and, just a young man in a charismatic movement. And I thought, this poor old guy just doesn't get it. So even in Christianity, you wall yourself off to arguments that you can't, you don't want to believe or don't want to accept. And it's funny. I did a test on myself. When I was deep in the Vineyard movement, it was super charismatic, and there was a lot of online attacks. This is before the internet, but AM and talk radio was huge. I used to listen to Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man, which was
Yes.
the ministry started by Walter Martin. Now, I actually heard Walter Martin speak in the Presbyterian Church, which was my first official church membership, where I was married as a young man, and Dr. Walter Martin came to speak, and I went and listened to him, and it was, this was part of the environment I was in, that there's the cults and then there's us, the true believers. And so when Hank Hanegraaff started attacking the Vineyard, he wrote a book called Counterfeit Revival. And I read that as a Christian, as a Vineyard Christian, as a charismatic Christian. And I thought, poor Hank Hanegraaff, he's so wrong. He's being so ugly. He doesn't understand. This stuff's not true. As a test, I picked that book up after I was an atheist, and I'd spent some time deconstructing, maybe a couple years in, and I read that book, and I'm like, holy crap! I don't agree with Hanegraaff's worldview. I don't agree with his Christianity, but he was spot on. Like, everything he said about the manipulated nature and how destructive the Vineyard movement was and is, he nailed it. And so I realized my perspective of how you read material is completely altered by your indoctrination, your brainwashing, your presuppositions going into reading it. And it was so eye-opening to me, and it's kept me now from, not like, I don't want to be dogmatic. Like, I'm an atheist, but I'm not like this hard atheist. It says, I know, like, maybe we live in a construct, maybe lizard aliens run the world. Like, I'm not ready to say anything I know for sure, because I know how easily I am deceived, and I know how easily my presuppositions or my bias goes into anything. And that example, that sealed it for me, because I read Hanegraaff's work and came away completely walking away with a different conclusion based on where I was. And that was a shock for me. And it allows me to understand how Calvinists and non-Calvinists can argue, and neither one hears what the other side is saying. And both sides are absolutely sure. And pick any issue: eternal conscious torment, or annihilationism, or women preaching, women not preaching, or, alcohol, not alcohol, any issue. And that's how people see it. And it's super hard to see that in yourself. So I've learned now to go into issues going, I don't know. Like, I don't know the answer yet. Let me see what the consensus scholarship says. Let me see what smart people say. And let me kind of try to do a sort of a Bayesian analysis of it and say, okay, I'm, evolution's a fact. Like, if evolution's not a fact, then we just live in a trickster universe, and who knows, anything's possible. Could evolution be overturned? Yeah, with evidence. Anything in science can be overturned with good evidence. It's not very likely in that case, but it leads me not to be too dogmatic or sure about stuff. If I hear a conspiracy theory, I'm going to mostly dismiss it, but I'll listen to anything. Like, I've heard people recently talking about maybe Paul is a fictitious character. I was a Jesus mythicist for a while, which I'm not today, but I'm glad I went through that period, because it helped me learn to study and read and question dogma. Because of course Jesus was real. That's the precept of a Christian. Of course he's a real person. It's so silly to think no. But now I realize, no, it's fair to question whether Jesus was a real person. And after questioning and reading it as an atheist, I land on, yeah, he was probably a real guy. But the question is a fair question, and the study of the question can bear fruit, to borrow a Christian term, about learning and about how we process information. And so, yeah, it's super fascinating how I think now as opposed to before.
I think it's a great point you make about, too, the dogmatism that can be sort of part of the pendulum swing, that just because we're leaving fundamentalism in Christianity doesn't mean necessarily that we're leaving fundamentalism. We're just leaving Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen that play out in a lot of our conversations in the secular community, where it's a certain way or the highway. And I think we're all guilty of it. We're all susceptible to it. And I think we need to remind ourselves, like you're saying, that this is something we could all do. We could easily just keep on writing everybody off. And it's hard, because I think you do at times your bullshit meter gets real sensitive, and you're like, I'm sorry, but that just doesn't smell right anymore. That sounds garbagey. That sounds made up. It sounds mythology based. But like a lot of people have tried to convince me to heavily investigate near death experiences, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And everything I've looked at that, I mean, people have sent me hundreds of articles and videos, and I've watched a lot of them. Nothing sounds remotely like it's worth giving even a minute of my life to. It sounds like it's all made up and it's all garbage, even the very best stuff that I've been sent. Yeah. But at the same time, I understand that that's my perspective, and my perspective doesn't make it right. There's someone else who's going to say, I've looked at the same information and it looks like it might actually have some validity. And it's hard. And at some point, you just have to sort of learn to swallow your pride and say, you know what? Like you said, I don't know. I don't know if there's more to this or not. But at the moment, from where I'm standing, I don't feel comfortable advocating for that at all. But I'm certainly going to advocate for your, everyone else's desire to research what they feel is important to research. And it's amazing too when you look back at the swings. I remember I wasn't part of any of these discussions when this happened, but I remember hearing about people talk about someone named Tommy Thompson, who was the first one, or one of the first ones, to advocate for the idea that Moses may not have been real. And that eventually, even though he lost his job and everything, lost his credibility, like 20 years later, everybody was saying that, yeah, Moses probably wasn't real, and David and Solomon probably weren't real. And it's funny how the pendulum swings. And I think the biggest thing for me is just I try hard to stay away from conspiracy theories and anything that smells like woo-woo, where I'm just like, it sounds more like we're getting into like Star Wars, the Force. But at the same time, I get it too, that it's like one of the things that's hardest for me when you talk about deconstruction and deconversion, if you go the materialist route, you end up, number one, and at least in my opinion, you end up pretty strongly in materialism and nihilism. And it takes away the beauty of life if you're not careful, where you're just like, we're basically just chemicals that sort of went into AI mode because, the chemicals just happened to evolve in the right way, and the winds were blowing the right way that day. And here we are. And you end up with this point where you feel like if life feels beautiful, like seeing a baby born, or, the idea of, lovers making love, whatever, beauty of a sunset, like life has so much beauty to it. Mm-hmm. And yet if it's just materialism and nihilism, that kind of gets pretty much, almost like a facade. Like it's not really beautiful. It's just beauty in the eye of the beholder, but it's not ultimately transcendently beautiful. And there's a part of you that has that angst of but I want there to be more. I know that there's no rewards in the afterlife to live for. If you do this, you're going to feel like it's worth it in the end. No, there's no in the end. There's no worth it. It's not going to add up to feeling like, wow, I lived a fulfilling life. It's just at the end of your life when you'd want to say, look at what I've accomplished. I feel so fulfilled. That's when you take your last breath and it doesn't matter anymore. It feels fulfilling perhaps to other people that are there at your funeral, but they move on and life moves on and you're gone. But it's weird. I almost feel like I live experientially, psychologically, emotionally, whatever, as if it mattered, even though it doesn't. And as if there's rewards, someone's going to, at the end of my life, clap for me, in a really significant way, even though I know intellectually that that's bullshit. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard. Does that resonate at all with you?
Yeah, 100%, especially having a new child at 59. So, looking back at my life, my mom died in her 60s. My dad just passed away. He made it to 81. I know healthcare has changed, and I'm not a drinker, and I don't have the lifestyle my dad had. So hopefully I can make it to 90 or 100. But let's say I make it to 90. That's 30 years. My son will have to lose his dad at a reasonably young age. So this question to me, it's not for me, it's not about, am I going to be rewarded after I die or what happens? I don't care. I mean, maybe something will happen. Maybe we live in a construct. Maybe there's some God. Maybe there's some afterlife. I doubt it. I don't think so. And I don't care. Why? Because my primary focus in this life right now is to help my son learn how to be a good human, to think critically, to develop his natural empathy, and to have a home life that allows him to express his desires and creativity and what he wants, so that when I do pass away, whether he's 20 or 40, he will hopefully cry at my funeral and say, my dad was a good man. he left a legacy that I now live out. And just knowing that even right now gives me euphoric thoughts, because I feel like, this is what I'm working on to help the next generation. And I know in a couple generations later, I'll be long forgotten, just like I don't know I know very little about my great grandparents and nothing about my great great grandparents. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that at the end of the day, I left behind a legacy of goodness where I can say, if more people in the world behave the way my kids behave, and I would say this even about my adult kids who grew up in Christianity, but left it and do good in the world. They do good things. They fight for good. And they love people. They love dogs. My older daughter runs a nonprofit, or she formed a nonprofit with some friends that rescue dogs and does dog stuff. Like, she's a good person. I am proud of who she is as a human being. And to me, that's the goal. The goal is to leave behind not a mess. The goal is not to leave behind dysfunctional adults that harm society and drain resources and hurt people. That's what I want to avoid. I want to go into my olden years and finally passing away, knowing that I left behind mess cleaners, not messers. My kids make the world better for at least some people. And so to me, that's the reward. And you would mention it too about like the birth of a child. I mean, I have a video of my son being pulled up by the doctor, because it was C-section. He was 6 weeks preemie. He got insane care. He would have died any other time in history and probably would have killed my wife because of the complications, because of secular humanism driving science and not relying on faith-based stuff, like demanding that we learn about cells and bacteria and how to save little babies. So he was in the NIC unit, and it was tragic and happy. But the NIC unit is the worst place on the planet and the best place on the planet. The NIC unit is where you realize you're going through a very hard time, but dedicated doctors and all the technicians, all the people, like thousands of people that worked on these machines to make it so that my son would receive this insanely good care and survive and thrive. So when you talk about miracles, I have a video of him crying, and I'm crying. I'm like telling my wife, who's on the operating table, oh, he's just so beautiful. Like, the doctor posted this like on his Instagram, and she's like, hey, look, the doctor put you're crying about our house. I'm like, he's so beautiful. I was like, because when he took his first breath and he started crying, I knew he was going to be okay. And to me, that was a miracle, but not a miracle in the way I would have said it as a Christian, because it wasn't supernatural. But I still I can accept that terminology. It was miraculous. He was beautiful. My life changed forever that day. And every day I am grateful for him being in my life and being able to serve him. When I change a diaper, I'm serving his needs. And I have respect for it, but I am not one of these, what do you call it? The neonatalist, the term for people who think it's not right to bring a baby in the world. Like, I get their argument, like the world's terrible and we don't have a right. It's not consensual. I don't agree with that. Obviously, I had a kid, but I recognize and respect how important it is, because we did bring this child into the world without his consent. When my girlfriend discovered she was pregnant, we had to discuss whether we were going to carry this child to term. That was a legitimate discussion that we got to have, because we're both secular humanists and atheists. Like, it wasn't like would have been when I was younger, where you don't even think about that. Like, it was a real question. And we both decided, even though we knew it would be hard, we wanted to be parents, and we wanted to change our life. And boy, it changes your life. But so every day it is for me, it's the act of giving to the next generation, and the act of doing my part to make the world a better place. And there's joy in that and beauty in that. When my son laughs, when we start laughing together, oh my gosh, my heart just breaks. It's so beautiful. So those kind of things as an atheist make life to me more beautiful. It's to me, it's more wonderful. And it's, well, it's not a supernatural miracle by any means. It's a miracle in the vernacular of, like, when you get lucky and you think, oh, I won I won a prize, or I found a great parking spot. It's a miracle. Those the way you use it in that term, the the serendipity is the right word. There's a word my dad taught me. It's serendipity. And boy, it's beautiful. And I'm happy about it. And it's what I don't think my old self would have recognized, and what I think Christians hearing me talk about this wouldn't recognize, is that the joy and the happiness is so much greater because I'm not offshoring credit. In my past life, I would have said, isn't it beautiful God saved my baby? Isn't it beautiful God gave me this baby? Isn't it beautiful that he's really God's baby, not my baby? Right? All the stuff we thought as Christians. No, he's my baby. I'm responsible. There's no God directing his life. It's on me and my wife. And we don't own him. He's his own self. That's the other big thing for me. No, yes, he's my son, but he's not my property. He is his own person with his own developing will. Like, he can't express it much now, other than, boy, does he get pissed off sometimes. Like, he'll be crying. He's not crying because he's in pain. He's not crying because he's he's scared. He's crying because he's pissed. Like, something in his life is not. So it's like, okay, let me work this out with you. Like, maybe your diaper's wet. Maybe you're bored. Maybe you're hot. Maybe, what do you need? And I realize I really like imparting this sense of self to my kids. Like, I did this even as a Christian, but more so now as an atheist. You get to decide. I'm not going to tell you that I want you to be a doctor or a lawyer or an Indian chief, or, like, boy, in the Christian world, there's so many, this happens so often that you're put into a mold. Your dad's a pastor, you'll be a pastor. Your family wants you to be a worship leader, or your dad's a carpenter or a plumber. So that's, it's just, you're going to follow in these. I mean, this is the way life went for most humans in most of history. But now the world is our oyster, right? My son today is going to grow up in a world we couldn't even have imagined, even, 40 or 50 years ago. We couldn't imagine. So he has the opportunity, and I feel my job is to help him learn to think and learn to be his own self, and not let other people tell him what to do. He wants to be a writer, a oil painter, a musician, a doctor, a lawyer. Then he gets to do, like, I want to provide the environment to foster his ability to find out what he wants to be and do. And to me, there's just so much joy in that, and freedom, as opposed to, let's pray, dear Jesus, what do you want him to be? Like, what's your plan for him, Lord? Like, thinking about how I used to be so sheepish in that, like, asking God, why would I ask God what I want? Like, let's pray what you should do. No, you get to decide. And that, of course, that's scary. That freedom is scary, but it's a good scariness, Wow.
The idea of the thought autonomy and psychological, emotional autonomy it's so critical in this. It's such a beautiful gift to give to kids. I was curious, just bringing it back to your story here, and I will probably tack some more questions on at the end, but just to kind of bring it to maybe the high point, as it were, of your story of the deconversion. When you finally said to yourself, I really have a problem here with this world, you're like, there's some real issues here. What were the final big things that you had to think through or study? And was your path more like thinking through the philosophical issues, like why does God let babies die of cancer at 2 years old? Was it more academics, like comparative mythology kind of stuff? Like, what was the final big thing that said, like, this is it? Like, all these other things I can kind of bury and put aside and wait till God explains them in heaven. But this issue or these issues are too much. Like, I have to figure this out. And what was it like? How long was that process when you thought through it or investigated it? And then if you could take us up to that point, like, was it a day or a week when you said, gosh darn it, this isn't real? Like, what was that like?
So I was thrust into things sort of out of my control, which led to eventually a divorce and child custody issues and fights with people at church. And I started saying things and questioning things that brought down this sort of like a heap of judgment. And so the initial chink in the armor was, wait a minute, these Christians aren't acting like I've been taught Christians are supposed to be. Community, love, mercy, grace. I'm not seeing grace and mercy. I'm seeing judgment. And one person told me, Michael, you have to realize it's a business. And I'm like, and this was a guy I'd gone to home group with, like a casual friend, but somebody that I knew in church who I knew loved Jesus, and I knew bought into this. It's a community, and it's something bigger. And, our home is in heaven. The world's not our home. And I had been doing, up until that point, I had become like a super Christian, going through a pending divorce, and there was sin involved and judgment involved, and people take sides, as everybody who's been through one of these divorces kind of know, and trying to defend yourself and trying to work out the animosities involved. And I threw myself into ministry. So I went to a sister church. I started attending a sister church to the Anaheim Vineyard, which was just kind of down the street. And it was a plant out of that church. And people knew who I was a little loosely. And I found a pastor who had a ministry called Need Prayer, kind of like the sign was kind of like got milk or something, or need milk or whatever, like need prayer. And I started doing street ministry with him. Like, we pray for people. And I was also going to classes on how to pray for people that were demonized. And so, I was in church more. I was reading more. I was reading Gregory Boyd, which led me to Stanley Hauerwas has a book, or Resident Aliens. Like, this is not our home. Our home's in heaven, and we shouldn't be so happy to demand the government's on our side as Christians. And that led me to Jacques Ellul, who was a French Christian anarchist. And so I was reading him, and I was reading Gregory Boyd, who's an open theist. And if anything was going to save my faith, it was open theism, because it's a theodicy that sort of lets God off the hook. But the cognitive dissonance that I couldn't get over was how people were treating me, especially pastors. And so, since my mom had been a pastor, now my mom was forced into retirement because of her illness, and she would die within a couple of years. So she was mostly bedridden and wheelchair bound, and she had friendships that were broken over the controversies that I was going through. And I just said to myself, how can this be true? How could the love of Jesus be true, and mercy and grace, when people are acting this way? So it just so happens that my dad had sent me Dawkins' God Delusion. I don't remember if it had been a year or two previously, but it had been sitting on my shelf collecting dust. When he sent it to me, I think I read the first chapter or two and went right over my head. I put it back on the shelf, didn't think about it again. But as I was going through with this, I'm like, I'm going to read that book. I wonder what Dawkins has to say. And the thing that struck me was, there are no such thing as Christian or Muslim or Hindu children. You're not born as a Hindu, you're indoctrinated into it. And I'm like, that struck me as being true. So that led me to question, wait a minute, if my mom had, for instance, stayed with the Hare Krishnas, I'd be a Hare Krishna today. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind that was true. And I remembered my mom taking us to some Hare Krishna event, and the Hare Krishnas are very wonderful, nice people. And I could have easily been bought and sold as Hare Krishna. And so at that point, I'm obviously starting to deconstruct, but I'm not an atheist, there's something wrong. And I went to a pastor I was in his home group, and he was sort of mentoring me through this crisis. And I loved him, and I trusted him. And I said, I'm thinking of atheism. And he said, he said, well, I read God Delusion and I don't buy it, but you need to pursue. Now, I will give him credit, and I respect this about him, in that he told me I needed to really put myself into thinking about it and really Like he didn't discourage me from asking questions and thinking. So I took him at his word and I really did what he said. I really investigated. And by some weird chance, I picked up this book by a guy named William Lobdell, who was the LA Times religion reporter, but he worked out of Orange County. So we kind of traveled in some of the same circles, had some of the same, like I identified with his story. And he wrote a book about how he became an atheist and found unexpected peace. So I read that book and I'm like, holy smokes, this makes so much sense. So he had gone through, he had left evangelical Christianity and went back to his, I think his wife was a cradle Catholic. So they got back in the Catholic Church, and he's the religion reporter. And this is right at the time that these Catholic Church scandals were breaking in Orange County, like in San Juan Capistrano and so forth. So I identified with the story and his experience. He had been in evangelical circles similar to me. And when I'm reading his book, I'm going, I get what he's saying. And I think there was a straw that broke the camel's back. I was involved in a ministry that was meeting at a street fair, and my old church sent some people, and there was a personal conflict, and the bigger church instructed the smaller guy to kick me out of the ministry. And to me, that was the end. Like, wait a minute, you're kicking me out of a prayer ministry. And I had a friend that was involved who had promised me that wouldn't happen because I knew there'd be a conflict. And they both told me, both the pastor in charge and my friend who got involved said, no, you were here. You've been working this ministry for months. We promise we're not going to kick you out. And then they both broke their promise. They kicked me out. And to me, that was unveiling the truth. Like people just say what you want to hear, and they're not honest. And clearly, if Jesus was real and praying for people and all this, if it was real, this couldn't have happened. Like, it just, to me, that was it couldn't be real. And so soon after that, I'm like, I just can't believe this. I got to the point, I was so desperate, I prayed to Satan. And I said, Satan, in a good Pentecostal way, out loud, Satan, if you're real, I will serve you if you prove to me you're real. You show up physically in this room and give me an assignment, and I will be your servant. I just want to know. Like, I want to know if it's real. And Satan ignored my prayer just like God always had. And to me, that was kind of, I go, like, if Satan won't even take me, like if he won't show up, like, to me, that was the proof that it's just made up in your head. Because I thought to myself, if there's really a Satan and there's really this big war and I'm willing to serve Satan and he doesn't take me up on it, come on, guys. Like, God didn't show up, Satan doesn't show up, there's a problem. So at that point, I think somewhere along the line, like I had a relative who was an atheist say to me at one time, you need to decide if you're mad at God or you don't believe in God. Because I was still going through the back and forth of, yeah, I'm really pissed at God. I don't understand. No, he doesn't exist. No, I'm just mad at him. No, he doesn't exist. And when I was told that, I was like, yeah, that's really true. I just can't bring myself to believe anymore. And so, I don't remember the exact day, but in that process, and this process took several months, probably maybe a period of 3 or 4 months where the main part of my deconstruction happened. And I just finally said, okay, I'm an atheist. I don't know. Like, I wasn't like, I'm an atheist because I know that there's not a God. I read a book by George Smith, Atheism, The Case Against God. It's like a classic book on like the philosophical arguments and so on. And that was very impactful for me. Like, it's safe to say that there's no God, but maybe there's a God, but it's certainly not this one, the one that I had served and spent my life giving money, thousands and thousands of dollars and time and missions trips. I had come down here to Mexico on a couple of missions trips. I went to Northern Ireland on a missions trip. I had served in the youth ministries. I had served in Sunday school. I had led home group teachings and the whole 9 yards. But everything under actually becoming a professional, which I kind of had wanted to, but since I had kids young, work and money, and I just never let me go to Bible school or become a theologian professionally. But when the wall came down, I realized I just can't believe. I can't believe. And so when I announced sort of publicly, hey, I'm an atheist, the Christian friends that I had, going through a divorce, people kind of aligned. So there was some people I'd already, our relationship had already fractured and we weren't really in quote fellowship anymore. But there was people that had really supported me, and they knew I was struggling, and they knew I was going through a hard time, and they knew that I was in crisis. I'm very depressed. I mean, there was a point in this process, I don't even remember the timing, but there were several points where I was feeling about taking my own life, and I was super depressed. And so I had friends that would invite me over for dinner and loved me. When I said I'm an atheist, ghost. Everyone ghosted me. My friends I had spent years in fellowship with that loved me never spoke to me again. And to me, if anything, confirmed to me that this stuff is just BS and evil. That was it. Like, how do you be you weren't really my friend. Like, if you're just going to ghost me because I'm an atheist, that means you weren't my friend. We were in the same club, as long as I was rooting for your team, we're friends, but now I'm not rooting for your team. You're, so to me, that solidified it. So once I had made the decision to study and learn, and over those few months came to where I couldn't believe anymore. Like, and it's funny because people think like I made some choice here. Like, I had a Christian apologist tell me, well, of course you have libertarian free will. You became an atheist. I'm like, you're insane. I didn't choose to be an atheist. I didn't want to be an atheist. I didn't start off this path of reading to be an atheist. There was no free will involved at all. I went kicking and screaming because at the end of the day, the evidence to me was so overwhelming that the Christian God was a myth, and that the idea of a God is probably not true. Even if there's some deist God, it's probably not true. But if there is, who cares? I know for sure Christianity is not true now. Like, it can't be. If it was, what I say today is, if some small segment of Christianity happens to be true, I would still reject that because it's so exclusionary. What kind of God would do that? Like, just let 1% of 1% actually have the truth. No, okay, I check out of that. Even if it were true, I would reject it. But overwhelmingly, it's just like not true. And then I started. Well, here's a funny thing for you. Here I am now, an atheist, a new atheist. I don't believe anymore. I just can't believe. And I said to myself, holy smokes, I guess evolution might be true. Like, I can't be a creationist anymore. But I didn't believe in evolution because I didn't know what it was. So I went and bought books and I started reading. I'm reading The Selfish Gene by Dawkins and Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. And I watched some YouTube videos. I'm like, wow, this theory is actually pretty elegant. And there's evidence for it. Wow, this is amazing. Evolution is actually true. And so that was a fun discovery to understand basic high school science when you're in your late 40s. It's like, wow. So that led me to have an appreciation for the scientific method and for science and for loving the idea of learning and history. And at the time that I deconstructed, of course, was the quote new atheist movement. So YouTube was filled with all kinds of debates and Hitchens and I remember I watched this Robert Price, Bart Ehrman, I think Milwaukee Atheist put this on, like a debate about the debate about mythicists. So I for a while I became a Jesus mythicist because it felt good to deny that he even existed. It felt really good. Now I don't land there today, but the process there gave me some enjoyment of the Bible as an atheist. Like, oh wow, this is a fascinating book, and it's fascinating how people perceive it. It's a eye opener to human nature because people go into it thinking, well, everlasting torture can't be good. Let me go through the book and find out why annihilation is true. And I realize now that's what people do. So when I started studying stuff, like the first time I read Bart Ehrman, he says, when you're a Christian, you don't read across the Gospels. You read like you go through Luke at Christmas time. You don't read the narrative, Luke and Matthew and Mark, and compare them. And he was right. I'd never done that as a Christian. And so I did it as an atheist. I'm like, holy crap, this is this is bizarre. I never knew that. So to me, that kind of sparked an interest in the history of, a lot of us describe ourselves, we're Christian atheists, right? Like we came out of this worldview and this environment. So, I remain respectful of Hindus and Muslims. I don't do stuff on my channel about why they're wrong. Like I don't think they're true, obviously, but
Yeah.
that when people bring that up, it's like, my history is Christianity, and my beef with how Christians mold and shape their world, and that's who I will attack, and that's what I will do counter apologetics about. Absolutely, I don't believe the Hindu story or the Muslim story, but I don't talk about that, not because it's just not me. I don't know it. I don't know their stories.
Yeah. No, just again, taking it back to your story here, and I'll just have a few final questions for you to wrap up after this. But sounds like your timeline was such that your kids were at that point mostly adults, either adults or close to it. What was it like talking to them about all this, knowing that they're probably Christians? Is that fair to say at that point?
Yes and no. So when I'm deconstructing, my youngest is also deconstructing, but not together. We're
Okay.
we're kind of in a custody thing, and I don't have that much time with her. And so I would later be accused of influencing her. And I remember a pastor, we were at like a memorial service or something, and one of the pastors, the youth pastors, said to me, our youth pastor's wife, actually, she said, "Are you still going to let her read the Bible?" And I'm like, "You just don't get it. Like, she's free to do whatever." I wouldn't be happy if she's looking at porn, for instance, but I'm not stopping her from what she reads, right? Like if she wants to read romance novels or serial killer novels or the Bible, which includes serial killers and and all kinds of terrible stuff. Like, no, of course I'm not going to stop her from reading that. She's deconstructing on her own. I would imagine nobody from that period would actually still, even today, believe me, even if they heard it from her own mouth. So she went through her own deconstruction. Now, the older sister had started deconstructing in college. So actually, at the end of high school, she kind of had some doubts. She went through kind of a phase with some parties and drugs, and I put the hammer down. You will not do this, and she went through the whole thing. She wore a purity ring. She made a purity pledge to me. She taught Sunday school. She was wholly on fire for Jesus. When she started deconstructing, she eventually she moved in with a boyfriend, and I would try to get them to come to church. And she's like, "No, Dad, don't. I'm not interested." She did a student exchange. She was in college, in business school, and she would eventually become a lawyer, but at the time she was in business school, and she went to Switzerland, and she came back, and she said, everybody I met in Switzerland is basically an atheist. Like, there's not a big religious thing. So I'm an atheist now. I realize I don't believe this stuff anymore. So she kind of went through a couple years of deconstructing. So I went to dinner with her and her younger sister, because I literally didn't know what the younger one was going, because I felt it would be abusive to try to tell her anything. So I took her to dinner, though, because I wanted to tell her, "Hey, I'm an atheist." And, because it's public now. So we go to dinner, and I say, "I'm an atheist. I want to talk to you about it. I know you're going to hear stuff." And she's like, "Oh, don't worry, Dad. I'm an atheist too." And I'm like, "You are?" She's like, "Yeah." And then she told me her whole deconstruction story. She had been praying that God would show her he was real, and she wasn't convinced. And so she just sort of deconstructed on her own. And then we talked about it. And then her older sister said, "Yeah, I think I'm, after the Switzerland trip, I kind of landed on so the three of us are like, okay, well, that's where we land." So that part was that kind of was easy. Now my oldest remained still a believer, and him and I actually had an argument just this year. I'm like, "What do you actually think's true?" And he's like, "Well, nothing really. Like, there's nothing specifically about Christianity I think's true." I go, "Why do you still believe in God?" And he goes, oh, well, when I die, I'm going to go to heaven and you're going to go to hell. And I go, that's Pascal's wager. You're being an idiot. And he goes, no, Dad, you're being an idiot. You're going to hell. So we had a big laugh about it. So he maintains this belief there's this God, but he doesn't go to church and he doesn't believe in a specific thing. So he's mostly deconstructed. He doesn't wear the label. And he's in the military. So it's tough to be too liberal, even though he works on liberal causes. Like he's an attorney that works and fights for progressive things. And he's extremely anti-Trump, but he can't be anti-Trump at work. I asked him if he would do some streams with me or recordings. He said, no, that would be very dangerous for my career right now. I cannot talk publicly about this. They streamed his graduation from, so he's got a master's in law now through this army school. And the chaplain came up and prayed to God, bless these students, blah, blah, blah. And then in the name of Jesus. And I'm on the phone texting him, the guy, he just prayed in the name of Jesus. Is that constitutional? And he goes, no, not really. And I go, and like, it's a bit of a thing. And I said, is there anybody there in your graduating class that's not Christian? He goes, yeah, there's some atheists and Jews. And I said, ask any of them if they'll talk to me. And he goes, well, I'll ask, but nobody will, because the environment in the US military, if you're anti-Trump, is very dangerous. So he's in that camp. So I feel like he's worked out this stuff. Now, when I was going through my deconstruction and he was still more of a theist, like, we didn't really argue about stuff other than we argue about everything, which is, I think, why my two kids are attorneys. So in our family, we could argue and yell and scream at each other, and it never had anything to do with love or respect. It was like, we argue about a board game. In fact, we will make other people in the room nervous and scared that we actually hate each other. He told me one time, he had me on speakerphone, and he told me later, he goes, I had you on speakerphone, Dad, and my boss. So he's in a military installation. His boss is probably like a lieutenant colonel. He goes, my boss said if me and my dad had that conversation, we wouldn't speak again for a year. And my son said, no, that's just a normal conversation with my dad. We just yell and scream at each other. So they were able to go through this process. Okay. I can imagine deconstructing with younger kids where one of the spouses is still going to church and doesn't want the kid exposed. I can imagine that would be very, very, very difficult. I was pretty much spared from that. So in that sense, it kind of worked out. And
with sort of the process from that point on, from the point of deconversion on, for most people, it is often just a weird journey where a lot of it's figuring out which way is up in the world now, and what's your path like, and how are you going to create meaning in a sense. And it's such a weird journey. But along those lines, what were some of the hardest things for you to sort of start over on in terms of reclaiming yourself, your identity, but maybe more important, like, what were the biggest things that you found healing in terms of the things you thought through, the topics, or just even things you did, whether it's, spiritual retreats or whatever it was, gardening, like what was it that kind of took you to a place of being at peace with yourself again after all this turmoil?
Well, the first thing I had to do was make new friends. So as I had said before, everybody ghosted me, and I wasn't in church. I wasn't going to home group. And I was living in Orange County, California, which is very conservative. So I didn't know, like, looking back on it now, I didn't have friends. It wasn't that I didn't have friends. I didn't know a person who was gay or atheist or a Democrat even, really. Like, I didn't have friends that were Black, or, I had some Asian friends. There's Orange County does have a significant population, especially where I live, of Asians and Mexicans. So it wasn't like I was a racist, but I didn't have any Black friends because they don't live there. It's not very friendly for Black people in Orange County. And I realized, not knowing any leftist, or not knowing, I didn't even know how to make friends. So I went online and I typed into Google, how do atheists make friends? What do I do? And Google suggested meetup.com. So I went on Meetup and I found a skeptic group. So I started going to meetings and get-togethers, and I made friends. I started dating. I started going to Cal Poly Pomona to listen to Michael Shermer lectures with Krauss and Dawkins and many other scientists. We went to observatories. We did a camp out in an observatory in San Diego. We did outreaches to Huntington Pier, where Ray Comfort would do his silly, have you ever wet the bed? Have you ever lied? Have you ever stolen a candy bar? You're a thief. So we would go down there with some posters and make ourselves available to people to talk, debate. And in fact, my youngest would go on some of these trips. I have a picture of her when she's maybe, I don't know, she's maybe 13 or maybe 14. She's got a sign, like love me or burn or something. And there was one time she got into an argument with some college students, and she was holding her own. I was like, wow, she's really read this stuff and processed it. She knows how to hold her own in a serious discussion. So we did stuff like that. So at the time, I want to say I was going through a terrible time of employment, and I did not have a stable home life. So I had her every other weekend and Wednesday nights. So Wednesday night was kind of like homework, have some coffee at Starbucks, talk about her week, make sure she caught up on her homework. And then the weekend we did hikes, we'd go to the beach. So we did have a very good, even though before that, obviously I saw her more, and we worked very hard to try to stay intentional about our relationship. And we went on some good hikes and beach days, and we talked a lot. And what I realized coming out of being churchy is we could have a real conversation about sexuality, about human rights, about how to live. And so that was very rewarding. And we ended up becoming friends. Fast forward to, I moved to Mexico, I expat. My older daughter, who was trying to get into a good law school. She had got accepted, but she didn't like the school. She wanted to study to get a higher LSAT score. So she calls me up one day and she says, Dad, I'm moving in with you. I broke up with my boyfriend. I'm moving in with you. And I still want to go to law school, but I need some time. So I'm like, yeah, okay. So she moved down here to Guadalajara, and then COVID hit. So she was living with her boyfriend, who she would eventually marry. And funny story, he moves in one day. She says, oh, Andres has moved in with us. And I go, why is that? She goes, well, the parents are strict Catholics and they thought I was going to ruin him. So they were going to send him to some reform school, and he just moved out. Like, as long as he was living at home, he had to follow their rules. So he moved in with me. So him and I became friends, and then they ended up getting married. When COVID hit, the youngest one was at University of Santa Barbara studying neuroscience. So that was her thing, that, as high school, she really liked the brain. So she goes to UC Santa Barbara. The whole campus shuts down, and it's super expensive to live there. So with campus being online, she's like, hey, Dad, I'm going to come move in with you. So we moved out of an apartment to a big house, and there was 6 of us living together. I had some roommates and both my daughters. Point being is, it was a testament to our relationship and how much healing had happened and how close we were, that both of my daughters not only moved in with me during COVID, they moved to another country. So that was very healing, because, we were locked in for months. We played board games, we cooked together, we became friends in a way that's almost impossible unless you're, living with somebody as an adult. So yeah, so the process of all of that has been very healing and wonderful. And I'm very proud of them now. And I wasn't a perfect dad, obviously, but I did my best to be loving and kind and work. And we sort of worked through that process of transition together. Like, we all had to grow and learn. And I'm super proud of them now, and I'm super grateful.
That's so cool. Could I ask, maybe just as a wrap up, your YouTube channel? You've got some great videos there. I've checked it out somewhat. I want to check it out some more, but you've got some interesting stuff. For anyone that hasn't seen it yet, could you just tell us how you got started and sort of what your passion is for how you want to, make the biggest impact through what you're doing there?
Yeah. So I originally, maybe a couple years ago, had done some cathartic videos about my sort of deconstruction and going through church stuff with the vineyard. And those are terrible videos. I left them on the channel, even though the production's terrible, the sound's terrible. everything about them is terrible, but they're just me ranting and raving. But they were very cathartic and healing. And over a few months after that, there was a YouTube channel by a pretty new YouTuber, this guy named Brandon of Mindshift. Probably anyone in the space has probably heard of Brandon. And he was having good success. Now, granted, he maybe only had 5 or 6,000 subs at the time. He wasn't a huge channel, but he was growing very fast. And I joined his Patreon, and it was the first time I'd ever done that. And I sent him a message, hey, this is the first time I'd ever supported a YouTuber who's in this space, and I appreciate your work. And I've been thinking about doing this myself regularly. And he said, you need to dive in and do it because the space needs all kinds of voices. So I thought about it and I started doing it. Like I started regularly uploading, and I started asking people for interviews. Like some of my very first interviews are just personal friends and family. Like I need to practice. Will you do a live stream? And they're like, okay, sure. So I eventually got some, I didn't even have, I had maybe 600 subs when I landed Mike Lacona, the Christian Bible scholar. And it was for just a fortuitous. We had some emails. He had told me, no, your channel's too small. My staff won't let me do it until you're a bigger channel. I'm super busy. And he messaged me one day and he said, hey, I have this hour. I'm all set up. I'm doing recordings. If you can do it in this hour, this time slot, I will be on your show. I'm like, done. I'll do it. And that kind of got me some recognition. And it also allowed me to reach out to other people. And I started doing more interviews with scholars. And I did some stuff with science scholars. I did stuff with other YouTubers. And then I started making response videos to Christian and I got more into it. Now, lately, probably in the last year, but maybe more in the last 6 months, I have spent a huge amount of my time working in conjunction with the issues of slavery and human rights. And I've done a lot of stuff with Black atheists or Black non-believers. So I just finished up releasing a series with 9 creators who are all African Americans who grew up in American church environments and have deconstruction stories of how it is in that community, because it's a very highly religious community. And their stories and the way that they are treated and go through this stuff is way different. So we talked about my response in dealing with these Christian apologetics about slavery, which really end up being very gross and disgusting. So that I'm very proud of that series because I reached out to people that don't normally have as much of a voice or much of platforms, including some very small channels. So I've made a point to reach out to small channels, and not just in that space, but in general. And so I don't know where I'm going to land going forward. I love doing response videos. I love doing interviews. When the baby came, I quit doing live. So I haven't done any live streams for like 6 months now. I do miss them. I've appeared on some other channel live streams, but it is hard to schedule something so strict as a live stream because you're live and, and the baby could need me any minute. I plan on getting back to those at some point. So I do enjoy that. The kind of people that might like my channel is something that talks to people sort of off the beaten path a little bit, and dealing a lot with human rights. Now, I haven't got really into politics, but I think I'm leaning that way. And that's a whole nother discussion. Part of the reason I haven't gone into it yet is I'm still having to deconstruct from my old conservative position. Like I didn't know any better. I was a white American Christian capitalist, who voted for George Bush and sent my son to Iraq proudly. Now, of course, I was praying for that he wouldn't get killed, but if he did, he'd be a Jesus, it'd be fine. So now I'm completely different from that mindset, but that is its own deconstruction. Like you don't just wake up one day and say, oh, I'm not going to vote Republican or I'm not a conservative anymore. It's a process. So I think my channel will probably over time will get more into, hey, what about these leftists and progressives and Marxism and sharing and universal healthcare? What about those things? Maybe they're not so terrible like I used to think. Maybe I was also deceived before. So I do want to get into that more. I do. So I do hint in some of my recordings when I'm talking to other people about that process. And then I'm getting there. I'm trying to learn. So I want to get there at some point where I'm talking more about how do we, it's fun to argue about, was the Exodus and Moses real? And why does William Lane Craig keep talking about how genocide's beautiful and babies went to heaven? So it's not problematic that babies were slaughtered. Those things are fun to respond to, and the debates are fun and whatever. It's fun. But I think more importantly, it's how has Christianity influenced the West, and specifically America, since I'm an American, to do things that are just horrific. Most Christians don't realize the history in America of slavery. Most people have no clue that the last debt slave in America was not released until the 1940s. Almost 80 years after the Civil War, there was still debt slavery in America. Most people don't know that. And why don't they know that? Well, because the past is whitewashed and sugar-coated for obvious reasons. So that has become a passion of mine, is countering apologetic lies about history, about slavery, emancipation. And I don't know, at some point I might get into some videos on suffrage even. Who opposed suffrage was Christians. It wasn't atheists and Jews and Hindus and Muslims in America saying women shouldn't vote. It was you Christians doing that. In fact, it seems like on every issue you were on the wrong side. So I want to get into showing the history of those movements and show why the secularist human, a lot of atheist Jews were, names we'll never know, were involved in fighting for human rights. So I want to dive more into the history of that and say, hey, do you realize in America, it was illegal for a white person to marry somebody who wasn't white? That was illegal. Like, people don't realize that Loving versus Virginia wasn't until the 60s. Like, I was alive. Like, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I was alive when it was a crime to either to have sex or to marry a woman of color if you were a white Christian man. Can you imagine living in that world? That's America. In recent history, in our parents' and grandparents' generation, that was the world we lived in. So when Christians deny that history, they perpetuate these cultural wars that will never heal until people are honest. And you can't be honest until you tell the truth. And you can't tell the truth. You're not even capable of telling the truth if you don't know what it is, if you're ignorant of history, if you don't know what Loving versus Virginia is, if you've never heard of this Supreme Court decision, then you're ignorant. You're just ignorant. Now, being ignorant is sometimes just part of life, because nobody could be a specialist in everything. But when you're purposefully ignorant so that you could perpetuate doctrines and dogma in telling people how to live, then it's just horrific. And this goes back to indoctrinating kids into Christianity and stripping their curiosity away, because you've just told them Christianity is the answer and it's good. So of course, when you hear, there's slavery in the Bible, your instant Christian thing is, yeah, but it was a good thing because reason, or it wasn't bad, reason. And you don't read history, and you're not curious. So that's the impetus. If you were to ask me, like, what's the driving thing behind my channel, it's getting honest discussion about the world and Christianity specifically, and how we as a society can embrace things that are true so that we can heal and go forward and make the world a better place. You can't make things better if you stay steeped in blindness. Sorry. The truth will set you free. So yeah,
it's amazing. Well, I love it. I'm so aligned with that stuff. It's crazy how similar we are. And I've got a separate channel. I'm doing something similar with politics that I'm trying to find time for, but a separate channel, the First Atheist President YouTube channel, that I'm hoping to get back to. But yeah, it's amazing once you start putting these pieces together, that when you escape from a mythology-based worldview, it has very real-world implications, not just for your personal life. I mean, that's where it's all wrapped up at first, is like, who am I and where do I go from here? but eventually realize that you have a desire, just like you did when you were a Christian, but you have a desire to change the culture. It's just from a very different perspective. But it's a beautiful thing to be able to help other people escape. And I think all the time about sort of that question of like, are we like, what kind of planet are we going to leave to our kids?
Yeah.
And what kind of kids are we going to leave to our planet? You know, and that those two sides of the same coin are massive. And it's, if you really take that seriously, it's hard to stay on the sidelines. It's almost like I take it almost like as a privilege issue in a negative sense, a privilege issue to stay quiet. Like, this stuff doesn't, affect me. Like, well, it doesn't affect you, but it's sort of like what's going on with all the Trump stuff now. It's like, it doesn't affect you yet. Number one, it might affect you someday. But number two, these are still, even if it never affects you directly, these are still your neighbors. These are still people that need help and are desperate. And, it just basic human empathy would tell you, I need to speak up and get involved in this. Even if my voice is small and does nothing, I want to, even if there's literally nothing that I do except create little sound waves, I can't stay silent. There's just something in me that says this must change, and I'll do whatever I can. And for now, it's little. If it gets to a bigger platform, I'd love it. But this world is hurting so much, and I love how so much of what I call it, the good stuff of Christianity, if you can call it that, if there is anything good in it, but all the things that you would look back at, like if you did a post-mortem on your time of Christianity and said, I know it's mythology, I know it's toxic, but what did you learn anyway that's decent? Like, sometimes it is appropriate at times to turn the other cheek and not fight. Sometimes the soft answer does turn away wrath. Sometimes there's different, aspects of the wisdom proverbs that make sense. And you think, I've learned some things, but one of the biggest things for me is make your life count. Seize the day, just, redeem the time, knowing it's evil, but redeem the time, knowing it's not evil, but it's time that what you are willing to put into and sacrifice now is going to, in a sense, be the seeds of the tree that gives shade to the next generation, as they say. And that, if you take that seriously at all, as we did in Christianity, that doesn't go away. That's the best part, not of Christianity, but of just being human, saying, I want my kids and grandkids to have something better than me. And I want it to be safer and more loving for all of our neighbors. And so it's an amazing thing to get involved. And I hope for your sake and mine that our platforms do grow and we get a chance to make bigger waves and just hopefully let people know too that are going through it, that are going through the hard parts, that they're not alone. Because that's obviously the darkest part at first, is realizing like, I don't know where to go and I don't know who I am, and nobody wants to talk to me anymore because I look like a heretic and an apostate. And it's like just knowing, there's people that love me out there. But.
Yeah, there's a big community. A lot of it is still underground, but it's growing. And there are friends. if you're going through stuff and you're not sure, there are people who have gone through the same or similar situations, and there is a lot of empathy and love and care. And I really think it's what you said, super important about recognizing the value that our kids could be in the shade of trees we planted that we never got to see the shade. Because in our former lives, we thought, well, Jesus is going to come back and fix everything, so we don't need to care. And now realizing that's not true. We do need to care. And I do care. I want my son to grow up in the shade of that proverbial tree you're talking about. And it brings me great joy working on the process and working on the things that will plant the seed, to use a very Christian metaphor, planting the seeds of that tree, and knowing that the world he will grow up in hopefully will be better because of even the little small part that you're doing, I'm doing, and our extended community is doing for.
Yeah. I love how when we were Christians, the words legacy and heritage meant the world to us, probably. And we're still there. We're still leaving a legacy. We're still creating a heritage, but it's a lot more beautiful and a lot less mythology based. Well, I appreciate so much you doing this. This is so good to hear your story. I do want to, again, remind everybody that Michael is a YouTuber, like we've been talking about. So please don't forget to go click on that link if you didn't already. Subscribe, check out his great work, support him. And did you have anything else to say before we wrap up today?
That's it. I just thank you, Tim, for inviting me on, and thank you for a wonderful conversation and great questions and having this platform. You're doing good work, and And I know people connect with this, even if you never hear from them. They're in the shadows and they're listening. And so if that's you out there, just like what we were saying, that you're not alone. I really hear that there are so many hurting people out there, especially if you're in a marginalized community. Come out, even if you just send private messages or leave a little comment on streams. There are people that have been through and are going through the same. And, you know, we do empathize and we do care and we want to see the world a better place. So thank you so much. I appreciate this very much.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Great stuff. Well, I'll just wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Michael Beverly. Again, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Great to get to know you. I want to do it again sometime. And who knows, maybe even interview some of your kids for their story too. But thank you so much for sharing with us today. And let's do it again sometime.
All righty. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.